Yes? Yeah? Good. Okay. So, so you've all come to PLMW at ICFP, which is fabulous. That means you're either embarking on or you're thinking about embarking on a career in programming languages research. And if you're anything like I was when I was a late undergrad, early graduate student, then probably you're thinking to yourself, well, finally, I'm done with this coursework. I can get down to some deep, serious science. Um, so, if you're a more theoretically minded person like I am, then yeah, you can spend your days going up to the whiteboard or the blackboard and rolling up your sleeves and doing some hardcore math and logic. Or if you're a more practically minded person, you can hack on your favorite the implementation of your favorite language, and that's going to take over the world. Um, However, the reality is a little bit different. So that obviously the technical work that you do is a big part of becoming a researcher, but there's another big part to becoming a successful researcher, which is then explaining the work that you've done, communicating the work you've done to other researchers, either by, or actually both by giving talks, as John Hughes will tell you about in the next session, and by writing papers, which is what I'll talk about. So, you may think to yourself, well, I know how to write a paper. I've written many papers like this one, for example, in school, and I know how to do this. It's no big deal. And you're probably right. It isn't such a big deal to write a paper if the target audience of your paper is one person, namely your college professor. But the problem is that that's a very different kind of paper from the kind of paper you write when you're a researcher. For one, when you're a researcher, you're not only communicating. When you're a researcher, you're communicating mainly to an audience that does not know your work, right? You know a lot more about your work than they do. Whereas when you're writing a paper for courses, it's typically the other way around. Your professor actually knows much more than you do. The other thing is that when you're writing a paper, you're writing not just for one person, but for a very broad audience, right? From top experts in the field, like the people who are giving talks at ICFP and PLMW, down to new researchers, like new students who are just trying to get a lay of the land and understand the field. So it's a very different kind of thing, so it requires actually some study. So show of hands, how many of you have actually read any papers in programming languages? Okay, most of the room, that's good. And how many of you who've read papers in programming languages have sort of thrown up your hands in despair at the inability to understand anything that's going on in the paper? All right, the same number, very good. Me too. Every day, whenever I read, not every day, but all the time. Okay, so I was on the POPL program committee this year, for example, and certainly on many of the papers I reviewed, I was throwing up my hands in despair at my inability to understand what they were talking about, and this is a serious issue. Oh, I forgot the transition there. So one reason you might think of why you're having a hard time understanding these papers is that you just lack the technical sophistication to understand what's going on. And that's part of it. You're probably right. You do lack the technical sophistication for some of the papers you're going to read, but that's not the only thing, and it's not the main thing. I would say the main problem is really that many papers are poorly written. Many papers, including many published papers that you will have to read for to understand related work. So this is like a serious problem that pervades the field. So why is this the case? Why are so many papers poorly written? So I attribute this to mainly to the fact that many writers don't know how to view their paper from the perspective of their readers. So the writer, and it sort of creates a gap between the writer and the reader. So the writer is really mainly interested in telling you about the piece of research that they did, and they're really excited about it. That's represented by this strange object in the middle of the slide. I don't know what that is. And so they just want to tell you about all the cool stuff that they've done with this object, So I don't know, something about the preaxial gaskets and, this great, they have a 47% reduction in something, and et cetera, et cetera. They're very excited about that. That's what they've been spending the last year of their life on. And so that's what they want to put sort of first and foremost in the paper. And the reader is over there on the other side scratching their head saying, well, okay, but what does that actually do, this object that you're presenting, and why should I care about it? And maybe once you tell me those things, then I'll actually be interested in understanding the technical details of your preaxial gaskets, et cetera. So really there's this problem that the writer wants to write a different paper than the reader wants to read. Sort of based on that motivation, I'm going to, before I get there. So the point is, if you can actually circumvent this problem, right? If you can bridge this gap and you can write clear, accessible papers, then wonderful things will happen. Okay, because it's so unusual, right? People will actually enjoy reading your papers. This is an unusual thing to happen. People will learn something from your papers. They will get accepted to conferences like ICFP at astronomically higher rates than other papers do. You'll have fame. Your work will have a lot of impact. You'll make a lot of money. Well, okay. Maybe you won't make a lot of money. What? Or impact. Yeah, I know. I should have continued the animation. I was too lazy. Or fame. But, whatever. At least people will enjoy reading them. Okay, so the good news is that there are principles to help you get there. So there's principles you can follow that will help you write clearer, more readable papers. And it's based on basically an understanding of how readers process information. And that's what I'm going to try to convey in this talk. Now, a lot of people, when they think about principles of good writing, they think of one book, which is Strunk and White, Elements of Style. So how many of you have ever heard of this book? Okay, quite a few. So I know a lot of people who like this book, who swear by this book. Personally, I hate this book. And the reason I hate it is that it focuses on some sort of a bunch of sort of aphorisms, so sort of short ideas about how to do good writing, which I think are too vague and abstract to be useful. So they're sort of two of the most famous things in the book are be clear and omit needless words. And these are considered to be deep observations. Personally, I find them useless because, if I knew how to be clear and I knew which words were needless, then I wouldn't need the book. But to each his own. Anyway, so I'm not going to be presenting ideas from Strunk and White, although there is some overlap, of course. What I'm going to focus on instead are a set of principles that are constructive, in the sense that it's actually easy to check if your text satisfies these principles, and if it doesn't, then these principles will suggest ways to improve the text. Now, these principles don't come from out of nowhere. They're inspired by a number of different sources. The main one is this book by Joseph Williams called Style Toward Clarity and Grace. I highly recommend this. It's a very nice book. It's actually, it's very nice, and it's readily available. It's not about computer science writing, by the way. It's a general writing book. Norman Ramsey has some course notes on learning technical writing, which are based to a large extent on the Joseph Williams text, but they add some interesting additional material. And Simon Peyton-Jones has a very nice talk, which you may have seen online, called How to Write a Great Research Paper, which is complementary to the other two. It's more focused on high-level structural issues, how you structure a research paper. So I'll be drawing on all of these. And also, I should also say, so this talk is really developed jointly with my wife, Rose Hoberman. She works at the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems, where I'm a faculty, as she's in charge of the skills courses. So she teaches courses and writing workshops and speaking skills workshops, and a lot of the ideas here were developed with her. Okay, so let's get started. So the talk is going to be in two parts. The first part, I'm going to focus more on low-level writing issues, how you structure sentences and paragraphs. And in the second part, I'll look at how you structure a research paper. So the first principle I want to focus on is flow. Okay, so flow means, and there's different words for this. Some people call it cohesion. The idea is that it should be clear how each sentence and paragraph in your paper relates to the adjacent ones, the ones that come before and after. And the reason is basically that you sort of as I showed you in the beginning, right? There's this sort of gap between the writer and the reader, and so you really need to sort of think about things from the reader's perspective and drag them along to the place where you want to be. Now that's a bit vague. Okay, so let's get into. Let me give you a concrete example, and then we'll see how to turn this into an actual constructive principle. So here's an example text. I'm going to read this aloud, and I want you to think about, is there a point in this paragraph where it seems like the text is not flowing? Security proofs of cryptographic protocols are crucial for the security of everyday electronic communication. However, these proofs tend to be complex and difficult to get right. The game-playing technique, originally proposed by Jones et al., follows a code-based approach where the security properties are formulated in terms of probabilistic programs called games. This is a general design principle for cryptographic proofs to ease their management. So, what do you think? Yeah.
I would get out of breath when reading the first sentence.
The third sentence, okay. But was it actually a problem in the flow of the paragraph? Did you get stuck there?
No.
It's unclear if third sentence relates
Exactly. So this third sentence is indeed the problem, and the problem is, yeah, what does this game playing technique have to do with what came before? Okay, so it's exactly what she said, so when you look at it, it's kind of obvious, like, okay, yeah, why did they write that there? Because it obviously doesn't have to do with the previous sentences. So it's an obvious problem of flow. And again, this is because the reason this comes up is because the writer of this paragraph probably, well, they obviously know what the game playing technique is. And they're building on it. So from their perspective, it's it's sort of common knowledge. So it's maybe it wasn't mentioned in the previous sentence, but they sort of know what it is, and so they fill in the gaps between these things. Whereas from the reader's perspective, the reader has no idea what the game playing technique is. So the solution is something that we call the old to new principle, and the idea is that sentences should begin with old information and move towards and end with new information. Okay, and this serves a couple of purposes. One is, by beginning with old information, you create a link to the text that came before. And by ending with new information, you create a link to the text that follows, which is probably going to depend on that new information. It also has the sort of side benefit that it places new information in a position of emphasis, because it's well known that actually the information you put at the very end of your sentence is sort of where the reader places most of their weight, and so this principle will do you very well. So let's look at this example again. So the problem here was exactly that the game playing technique, which was the beginning of the third sentence, was completely new information. Okay, so that's a clear violation of old to new. So the solution is, you could rewrite this paragraph in various ways, but one thing we can do is to rewrite it as follows. So we can rewrite the third sentence. So the first two sentences set up that okay, these proofs, these security proofs are hard to get right. To make it easier to manage such proofs, Jones et al. Have proposed a new design principle called the game playing technique. This technique follows a code-based approach where blah, blah, blah. Okay? So looking structurally, if you analyze this structurally, you see that the beginning of each sentence, after the first one, refers back to old information. These proofs, such proofs, this technique is referring directly to the thing that was just introduced. And also, the thing that is sort of the main point, the main new thing in this paragraph, the game playing technique, is at the very end of the third sentence. So that's in the ideal place of emphasis. So this is a very nice paragraph. The problem, however, is that's sort of first big principle, and I see a huge amount of text that would benefit from just a simple old to new analysis. You can check this very easily, and it fixes a lot of problems in writing. Yeah.
Didn't the first sentence violate the principle of having the most important thing last?
Well, yeah. So so that's not exactly the principle, right? So the principle is when you have connecting text, that the new thing tends to be towards the end. In the beginning of a paragraph, often you're announcing a topic. So that's a very good question. Yeah, it doesn't have to the most important thing is that the old is at the beginning. If you're going to have old and new, right? You're going from something that's already known to something new, then the old should be before the new. That's in some sense the key thing. Okay, but of course there's corner cases with things like the beginning of a paragraph. You're often setting up the topic of the paragraph, and it's a bit different. Okay, so right, so that's flow. Okay, but the problem is flow is not enough, not nearly enough. And here's an example why. So let's look at this text. I'll read it again. Lions and tigers are some of the most dramatic and awe-inspiring species of cats. Most of these large cats, however, are currently facing extinction. A smaller cat that has been more evolutionarily successful is the house cat. Although house cats are currently the most popular pet in the world, they are in many ways antisocial. It would therefore be interesting to study whether house cats can be trained to be more sociable. Okay, so any thoughts on this paragraph? Yeah, any thoughts on what do you think about this paragraph? Too many cats. Well, yeah. Oh, sorry. What happened to lions and tigers? Right, yes, indeed. We started with lions and tigers and somehow ended up with cats. Okay. So that's a good, yes, you're getting very close to the point. You sort of hit it. Ah, okay, yes. Yes, exactly. So, or what I call coherent. So yeah, exactly. There's no coherence, right? So there's great flow. The flow is perfect. It perfectly satisfies the old to new principle, okay? So each sentence led very nicely into the next one, but by the end of it, it's all a mush because there's no point to this paragraph, right? It doesn't add up to anything. So in addition to flow, you need coherence. It should be clear how each sentence in a paragraph relates to the big picture. And also this goes up the chain as well. So it should be clear how each paragraph in a section of your text relates to the point of the section. And a way of checking for this is what we call the one paragraph, one point principle. So basically, a paragraph should have a main point, and that point should be expressed in a single sentence, which we call the point sentence. Okay. Now, this point sentence there's different places you could put this point sentence, but for the purpose of, if you want like a single simple rule, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, it should appear at the beginning of the paragraph or very near the beginning of the paragraph. And that helps to sort of announce to the reader that like this is what the paragraph is about, and the rest of the paragraph is providing supporting evidence for that. So let's look back at this. Right. So looking back at this paragraph, right, all the sentences. I'm not a big cat fan either, but I enjoyed this paragraph actually, subject-wise. But so I thought all the sentences were very nicely constructed. But indeed, there's no sentence that says what the point of the paragraph is. And so I'm going to have to rewrite this paragraph completely. And putting the point sentence up front. So we'll say there appears to be a negative correlation between the charisma of a species and its ability to survive. Lions and tigers, for instance, are among the most majestic creatures in the animal kingdom, yet they are currently facing extinction. In contrast, the house cat is evolutionarily quite successful, even though it is mostly known for stupid pet tricks. So I think that's a good paragraph. Okay, and it gets sort of to what I think the writer of the previous paragraph, who will remain nameless, was trying to say, but it gets there right up front in the first sentence. Okay, so that's flow and coherence, right? You create flow with this old to new principle, and you create coherence with the one paragraph, one point principle. Now, for time, I'm just going to briefly mention two other principles of lower level writing that I think are very important. One is what I call name your baby. This basically means that when you have something that you refer to a lot, some concept or some system or some whatever that you refer to a lot in your text, then you should give it a unique name and use that name consistently. And I can't tell you how many times people, including myself, violate this principle, right? So it's sort of, you have different terms by which you refer to the same thing in different contexts. And so you may often have, one concept that's referred to in using multiple different, slightly different terms. Or you might have different concepts where you use the same term to refer to them in different places, kind of overloaded. And this just will confuse the hell out of the reader. And so this is sort of a simple thing to think about is if there are kind of important agents in your text, important things you're talking about, give them a name early on and use that name repeatedly in a consistent way. The other thing is what we call the just-in-time principle. So this means basically that you should give information precisely when it's needed and not before. And the typical violation of this is that people often like to give kind of extensive background sections early on in their paper where they go into a lot of details about stuff, but before any of that information actually gets used. That information may only be used much later in the paper in the technical section. And this is, you may think you need to give all this background information to convince the reader that you know what you're talking about, but it's just a bad idea. You should introduce this sort of more specific technical information only when it's actually going to be used. Okay, so that's it for low-level writing. And now I want to talk about the structure of a research paper. Okay, so popping up to a higher level. So there's many different ways to structure a research paper. If anyone tells you there's only one way to structure a research paper, it's not true. Often I find that content dictates form. Okay, so knowing what I want to say will change how exactly I want to present it. But having said that, there is a structure that I use a lot, and if I can use it, it almost always works very nicely. And that's the one you see here. So basically, it's a paper with 5 sections, broadly speaking. Some of these can be split into multiple sections. One is the beginning. You begin with the abstract as required, a couple of paragraphs. The intro is typically 1 or 2 pages. A main ideas section. Not all papers have this. This is something specific to this kind of structure. That's usually like 2 to 3 pages. The technical meat, this is where you actually present your technical details and back up your claims. It's often quite a bit longer. It's like 4 to 6 pages. And then some related work section where you compare with related work, and that's like 1 or 2 pages. So I'm going to talk about 4 of these 5 sections in this talk. Can you guess what the 5th one is that I'm not going to talk about? Indeed. So can you guess why I'm not going to talk about it?
Nobody cares.
Leonard, come on, 5 people care. Don't exaggerate, please. So, indeed, if only 5 people care about reading your technical details, then if you have to put emphasis on if you have to put priorities on things, on making your paper well written, focus elsewhere. Okay. Obviously, I'm not telling you should write a bad technical section, but if you write all the other sections really well, then it will make up for problems with the technical section. Also, it's actually very hard to give general principles for a technical section because this varies so much between different topics. Okay, but so that's why I'm focusing on the others. So let me start with abstract and intro, and I'm going to kind of treat especially for time purposes, I'm going to treat abstract and intro as basically a similar thing because personally I view the abstract as essentially a sort of very condensed version of the intro, and it follows the same general structure. So this is what I call the CGI model, which stands for context gap innovation. So these are the 3 sort of stages of an abstract or intro. The C is for context. So context is where you set the stage, usually very briefly. So in an abstract, this might be a sentence. In an intro, it might be a paragraph or 2 paragraphs at the most. And this is where you're setting the stage. You're telling the reader what is the general area of this paper. And making them feel kind of comfortable, right? This is typically where you want the reader to not feel like they have no idea what's going on at this point. Because if they have no idea what's going on in the first sentence, then it's hopeless. They're not going to read anything more. But you're not saying what your specific problem is. You're just sort of setting the stage. The gap is where you actually explain the problem. So the gap is where you explain the specific problem that you're working on, and also, importantly, you explain why existing work does not solve, or at least does not adequately solve, the problem. And then the rest is the innovation. What is new that you're doing? Right? You have to state very clearly what it is you're doing and explain how it helps fill the gap. It doesn't have to completely fill the gap. Often, you do work that doesn't, that makes incremental progress. So you don't solve everything in one paper, but it should explain clearly what it does, what part of the gap it does fill. And so that's the basic structure. And so to give you an idea of how this works, I'm just going to show you a sort of positive example here instead of a negative example. And that's an abstract for this talk that I'm giving right now. So we'll start with the context. Learning to write well is an essential part of becoming a successful researcher. Hopefully you all buy that. If not, this talk is hopeless. Gap. Unfortunately, many researchers find it very hard to write well because they do not know how to view their text from the perspective of the reader. Okay, that's the problem. And the innovation. In this talk, we present a simple set of principles for good writing based on an understanding of how readers process information. Unlike such platitudes as be clear or omit needless words, our principles are constructive. One can easily check whether a piece of text satisfies them, and if it does not, the principles suggest concrete ways to improve it. Okay, so that's clearly setting up sort of what is the contribution? It's this simple set of principles, and why is it good? Why does it help fill this gap? It's because it's actually constructive, so it's something that the writer can use to fix this problem that they don't know how to write well. Okay, so so that's the basic idea for an abstract and or an intro. And I find this personally, I follow this all the time. I think it works very well. And it also, by the way, it has this flavor of again, trying to bring the reader from where they are, which is not knowing very much or anything about your specific problem, into being interested in it, and then actually being interested in what you're actually going to do in the paper. So the introduction is very similar, as I said. There are alternative opinions. So if you watch Simon Peyton-Jones' talk, for example, about writing, he advocates an approach that I basically think of as sort of the eliminate context approach. So he says you start off the bat with a concrete example, like consider this Haskell code, and then you dump some Haskell code on them, and you explain what's wrong, why this is a problem, or why it's hard to type check this, or whatever. And I find that, so if this works, it can be very effective. I find it often doesn't work because it assumes the reader has already has the context of being interested in understanding that Haskell code. But this depends. If your audience is, for example, ICFP or the Haskell Symposium, it's probably a reasonable bet that they're interested in understanding how to make Haskell better. Okay, but in some broader conferences, I think you often need a bit more context. Okay, so moving on. I only have another 3 slides. So actually, how much time do I have? A few minutes. 4. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Okay, so. So the next section is the main ideas section, and this I think is crucially important. It doesn't necessarily have to have, there's no rigid structure for a main ideas section. The main point is that you're trying to get the reader to have a big picture idea of what you're doing. I mean, it's beyond the introduction, so they know what the paper's about. They know what you're claiming to do, but they want to know sort of how you do it roughly. And I view this as a lot like when you're trying to explain to someone, at the whiteboard how the main idea of your paper. That's the level at which you write this introduction. Basically, what that means is, first of all, when you're showing something at the whiteboard, you don't write out the formal rules. Well, okay, maybe you do, but I wouldn't recommend it. Generally, you want to sort of give concrete examples that illustrate the points of your paper. Something you can write down quickly on the board and say, look here, and you point around and get the high-level intuition. Okay, so use concrete illustrative examples a lot, and you don't have to show the general solution. You don't have to even show examples that illustrate the full power of your general solution. You're just trying to get them the idea. The general solution will go in the technical section for those who care about the details. Now, a lot of people, when I've suggested this to some people, they sometimes say, well, do I really need it? I mean, maybe my paper, the page limit's kind of short, and for some conferences, not for ICFP, but for other conferences, can't I skimp on this section? And I say it's a bad idea if your page limit is so low that you can't have a main idea section. That's pretty unfortunate, because this section serves several purposes. One of them is it forces you to have a takeaway. Okay, a lot of papers that I read that are bad, the main problem is there's no takeaway. There's just like a bunch of stuff, and I don't know what to take away from the paper. What do I learn from this? So having a main idea section forces you to articulate a takeaway, which you might otherwise not have to articulate. The second thing it does is that, or another reason why the takeaway is important is that many readers really only care about the takeaway. In fact, the vast majority of the time when I'm reading papers, I don't care about the technical details. I really just want to know what's the basic idea of what they did, and that's what this section does. And the third thing is that even for the readers who do care about the technical details, all 5 of them, the main ideas are still useful as a way of what I call scaffolding, right? So sort of setting up the basic structure of your technical contribution, the main sort of high-level points, so that when you get to the technical section, you have some intuition to help make it more understandable. Okay, so I just want to conclude by talking very briefly about related work. This is a very important section because this is in fact, did I put that in my? Yeah, I showed actually the intro and related work. In the paper proper, the intro and related work are the most read sections. The intro because that's the very high level part, and the related work because when people are reviewing your paper or when or they're trying to understand the field, often the related work is where you really get to see the connections between different papers. And it's where people go to see if they've been cited. So one thing that's important is this should go at the end of the paper. Okay, so you'll often see that people put their related work section pretty early in the paper, maybe after the introduction or as part of the introduction. I think this is a mistake. I think in the introduction, obviously, you need to set up your gap properly. You need to explain what the problem is, and that may involve mentioning some related work. But that's separate from a related work section. Right? The purpose of a related work section is you've presented your work in full, and now it's time to actually give a proper, in-depth comparison with a bunch of different pieces of related work and explain why yours is better. Right, and that brings me to the second point, is to give real comparisons. So a lot of the classic blunder in a related work section is to just give a laundry list. In other words, just a list of paragraphs with no connection where you just say, so-and-so did this, and these other people did that, and you don't really give a comparison. So what you want to do is actually structure it so you give meaningful comparisons between what you've done and the related work, and explain why your work fills the gap you've set up in the introduction in a way that related work does not. Okay.
Well, you might build on other papers and mention that.
Yeah, of course, yes, you can mention, yes. Yeah, no, I mean the comparisons, right? Yeah. But in some sense, often that the kind of stuff you're building on will get mentioned earlier, because as part of it, sort of setting up your work, might review some work that was done before. So but people, I mean, I would say the main purpose of related work is to give these kind of comparisons that tell the review. Certainly, when I'm reviewing a paper, I often just skip to the related work to see what the authors think is better about their work than something that came before. So that's about it. So we've gone over several low-level principles: old to new, 1 paragraph, 1 point, name your baby, and just in time, and then these pretty simple high-level principles for how to structure a good paper, or at least one way of structuring a good paper. And if you can actually execute these principles, and which are they're very easily checkable, then you have a great shot at turning your paper from being incomprehensible to being, well, quite readable. Okay, so thank you. Any questions? Yeah, James.
I have two questions. One is very short but might have a long answer, and one is
It's very long, but might have.
short but might have a short
Okay.
answer. So the short question with a possibly long answer is: there's a missing part of your talk, which is about titles. Something about paper titles.
Yeah.
Okay.
What? No, no, no. What? Yeah. Well,
All right.
do you want me to say something? Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question. So I deliberately left that out. One, because I don't have yet developed a clear. I have not yet developed a clear theory of how to do good titles. I focus ridiculous amount on titles. My students always laugh at me because I like. I think because the title indeed is read. I mean, if the abstract is read by whatever it was 1,000 readers, then the title is read by 10,000. Um, and so I spend a ridiculous amount of time thinking about how to write the title, and I often think about that first before I've done anything else, because it helps me think about like what is this really, at a very high level, what is this paper about? But unfortunately, I don't yet have a good theory about this, and it kind of it often it requires some So I don't have a good answer to you. Sorry.
A follow-up question leads directly off from that,
Yeah.
which is you've given space complexity for a paper.
Yeah.
You've now talked about time complexity. So how much time should you allocate to each of these bullet points?
I would say roughly in the same way. I mean, so not proportional to the space, but proportional to the number of readers. Right. So, well, okay. Well, that's why I spend a ridiculous amount of time on the title. But I'm not kidding. I often think about the title months in advance, like to sort of whet my appetite for writing the paper. But no, but well, okay. Let me revise that. So, the abstract I don't tend to work on very much at all. I typically write the intro, because to me the abstract is just a condensed intro. So I wait until the paper is basically done, and then I look at the intro and I turn it into a 1-paragraph or 2-paragraph abstract. So I wouldn't write the abstract first, but sometimes it's not bad to try writing abstract and see if you can isolate the high-level ideas. But other than that, I basically write a paper from front to back. So I start with the intro. I spend a long time on the intro. And then move to main ideas, and then the related work usually again. Related work is very important, but I put it at the end. I write it at the end because, and usually pretty quickly because I sort of want to know what it is I've said in the paper. It's sort of hard to write a detailed comparison until you know exactly what you said. It can really change the details of the related work. So that's how I do it. Yeah.
On the related work, you say both that it should be at the end because people will have read the paper and you can revise it, and also that much more people read it than the actual paper.
Yes.
So there is a tension here. So how do you resolve that? Should there be two levels of reading the related work section?
Sorry, you said the first thing is that you put it at the end of the paper.
Because you said put it at the end.
Yes.
So that you can rely on the exposition you did.
Oh, I see. Yeah, well, so the thing is, that's a very good question, actually. Right, so the question, to be clear, was, right, that you put this related work section at the end precisely so that you can compare to details that you've talked about in the main body, but at the same time, you expect a lot of people to read it. So there's sort of two different audiences: the high-level audience that's just going to go straight to the related work, and the more detail-oriented audience that reads the rest of the paper first. So I think the thing is that if someone just goes directly to the related, reads like the intro and then goes directly to related work, then they're not expecting to fully understand it. Okay, they can't possibly, because they can't possibly fully understand it. But one thing you can do, and which I do strive to do in my related work sections, if I put enough effort into them, is to give good structure to it. So, like, instead of just, a very common thing with related work sections is you just, you write it like 6 hours before the deadline, and you just like, oh, what is all the related work? Okay, we have a paragraph on this, paragraph on this, a paragraph on this, and you try to do good detailed comparisons in each paragraph. But then there's no like high-level structure in the related work section. If you have time, what you should do is think about like what are the themes, what are the points of comparison that are shared with several papers, and bring those out in different subsections. So, maybe there's something about your work that is solving some particular problem that afflicted a number of pieces of prior work. So you put a whole section on that problem that you're doing better than other work. Getting this right is hard. I mean, I won't kid you. It takes rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. And since, as a practical matter, the related work section often gets done sort of towards the end, this often doesn't happen. But I think when you're revising your paper, this is a very good idea, because to try to bring out these bigger themes, because then more people will be able to read it precisely, even if they haven't read earlier in the paper. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Actually, he had a question first. Yeah.
the typos and the grammar errors, it's quite hard for like a student
Right.
who's not native in English.
Yeah. So I mean, personally, I don't think they're that important. I mean, if yeah, I obviously you want to not have typos and grammatical errors, but it's much less important than anything I talked about in this talk.
So you don't think it's worth it to spend a lot of time to check for that?
Well, you should check, but I mean, if you have to prioritize, I mean, that's another thing, right? When you get advice about writing, it's like you should be a perfect person. No one's perfect. So if you have to prioritize, I would much more prioritize the other high level things than typos. I mean,
Do you have any advice on where to put experimental results, like, and especially how it would relate to related work, because you kind of have a dependency there.
oh, I see.
Or like,
I mean, generally, again, the idea is so I would you only want to mention other things like related work, which is not sort of central to understanding your contribution. You only want to mention them if it is central to understanding your contribution, right? Sorry, you only want to mention them before the related work section if it's important for your right. So yes, of course, in an experimental section, if you're trying to show that your performance beats that of Jones et al., then you need to talk about Jones et al. And what they did and show the benchmarks or whatever, right? So yes, but you would still only mention it as necessary. Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm not from academia, so totally outside
Yes.
perspective question. What if you make the whole thing more like wiki and then make it interactive? So if you have people have questions, they can just ask them on internet, and then you can kind of interactively.
Well, I mean, I think that's a great complementary mechanism, but it's just a fact of life that the way that research gets disseminated, at least currently, is through papers and conferences. So and the conferences are currently determined by the papers that people write. So I've heard many people propose other approaches just like that. I would say nevertheless you should write well even if you're writing on a wiki. So I mean, I think all these principles apply. Okay, maybe the high level structuring of the into a form of a paper is a bit different, but I don't see that any of these principles really wouldn't apply. Yeah.
do you have any tips for turning a paper into a presentation?
And tests. What I didn't hear the word.
Turning a
Tips. Right. Any tips for turning a paper into a presentation? Well, that's a whole other talk. So I think the first answer is listen to John Hughes' talk in an hour or whatever, and then come talk to me, and I can, yes, of course I have tips for doing that, but that's another ball of wax. Yeah.
So I think we're a little bit over, but you're going to be sticking around.
Yeah,
right?
I'm around. Yes,
So,
I'm around.
So just catch there.
Yes, I'll be around all week, all through Wednesday.